Chapter 6 Tree Selection. Objectives. 1. Discuss the benefits of trees to the landscape and the environment. 2. Describe the site characteristics that should be considered prior to tree selection. 3. Explain the characteristics of a tree that must be considered when selecting a species. 4. Explain what to look for in selecting healthy, vigorous planting stock. Introduction. Trees are the largest, most dynamic and long-lived components of the urban landscape. They beautify and enrich our lives throughout the year with their variety of forms, flowers, fruits, seasonal leaf colors, and interesting bark. They sequester carbon, create ecosystems, provide oxygen and cooling shade, and filter out some pollutants from the air. Trees deflect noise and wind, block unwanted views, and protect the soil from erosion. They can also reduce rain runoff by capturing and holding rainwater on the leaves and branches before it reaches the ground. Trees have even been found to have positive psychological effects such as reducing stress, reducing crime rates, and reducing recovery time for hospital patients. Too often, however, we take trees for granted, not realizing that the benefits derived from trees can be largely dependent on careful planning and selection. In fact, if a tree is not properly matched to the landscape site, the tree can become more of a liability than an asset. Choosing the right tree for a particular site is one of the most important decisions to ensure long-term benefits, beauty, and satisfaction. A poorly sited tree will eventually require more frequent and costly maintenance. Matching tree and site. The first important part of tree selection is matching the tree with the site. Each tree species has certain environmental requirements for light, water, soil conditions, growing space, and other conditions. Thus, the environmental characteristics of a particular planting site determine which plants will thrive. In addition, most trees are planted to fulfill a particular function in the landscape. For example, trees may be planted to create shade for a backyard patio. So, it is important to choose a tree species or cultivar that will fulfill the desired function and be capable of growing in the cultural and environmental conditions at the site. By selecting the right tree for the right site, not only can you increase the tree's chances of survival, but you can also reduce the ongoing maintenance costs of pruning, fertilizing, and pesticide application. If you select well, the tree you plant could be around for many generations of people to enjoy and many generations of arborists to admire. With such a variety of site and plant considerations, it is necessary to set priorities in selecting a tree. The highest priorities are those that will affect the survival of the tree, such as moisture requirements, pH adaptability, and light needs. Sometimes the functional goals cannot be met entirely because of site limitations. For example, if a screen is desired an evergreen species might be selected because it would provide year-round screening. However, if shade is a limit ing factor, a broadleaf species might be selected because few needled evergreens grow well in shade. Adaptability is a species' genetic ability to adjust to different environmental conditions. Some species are more adaptable than others. For example, red maples, Acer rubrum, tend to grow well across a large range of environments, while palms will grow only in warm climates. Acclimation is the gradual process by which a given tree adapts to changes in its environment. This usually involves physiological or morphological changes. For example, some trees acclimate to shade by developing larger, thinner leaves. Trees with variegated or colored foliage tend to lose variegation or color when grown in the shade, maximizing their photosynthetic capacity. While it is possible for some trees to acclimate to certain site conditions such as partial shade and low moisture, a tree will have a much greater chance of survival if planted in a site that mirrors its natural growing conditions. Some books and software provide lists of trees adaptable to certain site conditions such as shade, wet areas, and urban situations. Although such lists may be very helpful, it is important to keep in mind that many factors influence survival. For example, baldcypress, Taxodium disticum, is considered to be tolerant of wet soils. However, if the tree has been grown in an upland nursery area, it may not do well if transplanted into a wet site. Looking again at our red maple example, even though the species as a whole has a wide tolerance range, individual trees selected from a subtropical seed source may not do well in a temperate climate, and vice versa. Computer-aided plant selection resources have made the plant selection process a little easier. These programs generate a list of trees that match site and plant characteristics chosen by the user. For example, the software could generate a list of trees that are native to a region, are drought-tolerant, are less than 35 feet, 10 meters, tall, and have showy, white flowers. Site considerations. Competent professionals do a site analysis before a landscape plan is designed. The site analysis records and evaluates pertinent existing site conditions to determine factors that will affect plant selection. In addition, the functional goals of the design are outlined. This helps the designer select plants that are appropriate for the site. Therefore, many site characteristics must be taken into consideration in plant selection. Plants may be limited by growing space, water availability and drainage, soil texture and pH, light levels, weather, and site use or function. Trees can suffer if one or more of these factors are incorrect or incompatible. Trees cannot be expected to thrive, or even survive, if their basic biological needs are not met. The amount of growing space available is important when selecting the type of tree to plant in a particular site. The area above and below ground must be large enough to allow the tree to reach its mature height, branch spread, trunk diameter, and root volume without interfering with surrounding objects. It is easy to forget that many trees can grow more than 100 feet, 30 meters, in height if conditions are favorable. Many trees grow wider than tall, and roots have the potential to extend well beyond the farthest reaching branches. Large trees can be wonderful assets, especially for shade, as long as they have enough room to mature. However, tall-growing trees should never be planted beneath or near utility wires. Likewise, trees without sufficient soil, growing space may grow poorly and can interfere with sidewalks and curbs. Similarly, by knowing the mature branch spread, one can avoid planting a tree too close to a building where it may cause damage to the roof or siding, or too near an intersection where it may block visibility. The climatic or environmental conditions of the region must also be considered. This includes not only the climate of the geographic zone but also the microclimate of the planting site, which can be affected by buildings, topography, pavement, and other surroundings. Light levels may significantly affect plant growth and survival. We often think of excessive shade as a problem to some trees, because many trees cannot survive in a heavily shaded site. Their branches grow long and spindly, and they may drop some leaves. Bright light or reflected light and heat from buildings and paved areas can also cause severe problems if a tree cannot adapt to those conditions. Some trees will develop scorched foliage and may wilt in high temperatures. Others are adapted to bright light and heat and have small, thick foliage and sunken stomata to reduce transpiration. The soil conditions of the site must also be considered. It may be advisable to get a soil analysis to determine the texture, pH, soluble salts, and nutrient levels of the soil. One of the most important aspects of soil is its water holding capacity and drainage. Trees planted in a site that is too wet or too dry will often die within the first year. If the soil is compacted, tree growth may be greatly reduced because of insufficient oxygen in the root zone. Tree managers must be alert to soil contaminants such as road salt or herbicides that could poison the planting site. Once the site has been analyzed, the next step is to consider the design criteria. Design criteria are based on the functions the tree is expected to serve. These functions include engineering, architectural, and personal safety considerations such as controlling pedestrian traffic or hiding unsightly building features. Sometimes climate controls, such as wind screens or shade for an east or west exposure, are desired. Even aesthetic considerations such as colored foliage or flowers can be a design criterion. An ornamental tree may be planted as the focal point of a landscape. Urban sites, especially street tree plantings, can pose some of the biggest challenges. Usually the underground space is limiting and the original soil has been greatly disturbed. Soil compaction may be extreme, the pH may be inappropriate, and moisture levels are likely to be suboptimal. Add to this the stresses of high reflected heat and light, de-icing, salt injury, and the threat of vandalism, then it becomes clear why municipal arborists struggle to find trees that will survive. Selecting trees that can also meet the design criteria may be next to impossible. Some urban sites are simply not suited for trees. Tree considerations. Many factors must be considered when selecting a tree for a given site. These include cold hardiness, heat tolerance, drought tolerance, growth rate, size at maturity, form, insect and disease resistance, nuisance potential, and maintenance requirements. Specific plant characteristics may make a tree more desirable. These characteristics might include exfoliating bark, bird-attracting features, or an interesting branching habit. Some trees are admired for their flowers or leaf color change in the autumn. Other plant characteristics, such as excessive leaf, fruit, or twig drop, may preclude the use of certain trees adjacent to a sidewalk, patio, or parking lot. Arborists should also consider future tree and site management when selecting tree species. Some plants require more water than others, and supplemental irrigation or drainage may be necessary in some landscape situations. Ensuring adequate water is especially important in the first and second growing seasons following planting. Certain trees need to be pruned regularly. Avoiding plants that will require significant maintenance, pruning, pest management, frequent irrigation, or fruit cleanup is wise. Fast-growing trees are often tolerant of poor soil conditions and owner neglect. Furthermore, they quickly reach a size where they provide certain functional uses such as shade and screening. However, fast-growing trees often have weak, brittle wood and develop multiple branches with included bark that decays readily and may break easily in storms. They usually do not live as long as trees with a more moderate rate of growth. Selecting a tree with a particular growth form can sometimes offer a solution to a growing space problem. For example, a large tree with a narrow, upright, fastigiate, habit, growth form could be planted closer to a building than one with a spreading form. Cultivars of some tree species are available with different growth forms such as upright, pyramidal, or weeping. Trees with different growth forms also provide a variety of architectural effects in the landscape. Too often, we forget to consider the root system of a tree. The rooting space available can restrict the choices of trees that can be planted. Also, some trees have a strong tendency to form surface roots that can damage pavement and cause problems for lawn mowers. Hardiness is a plant's ability to survive low temperatures. Many trees native to warm climates are not hardy in colder climates and will not survive. The U.S. National Arboretum publishes a map of hardiness zones that labels each geographic area in North America for low temperature extremes. Other references throughout the world contain similar hardiness zone maps. Plant reference books and software list either the lowest, coldest zone in which a tree will thrive or a range of zones where the plant will grow, for example, zones 5 to 8. However, plants that are considered hardy in a given zone may still decline or die because of low temperatures if their roots are above ground in containers or if the microclimate around the plant is unusually cold. Just as some plants are not suited for severely cold temperatures, others may be stressed by high temperatures or dry conditions. For example, several of the white-barked birches, Betula spp, are native to cool weather locations. But if planted in warmer climates, these trees are stressed by summer heat and are subject to borer infestation. Sometimes deodar cedar, Cedrus deodara, will grow well in Mediterranean-like climates but will do poorly in more humid locations in the same hardiness zones. Heat zone maps, which are similar in use to hardiness zone maps, help in the selection of plants that will grow in warmer climates. With arborists taking a more holistic approach to tree health, more consideration is given to tree selection. A particular concern is pest resistance or susceptibility to pests such as insects and diseases. It is important to select a tree that will not be stressed on a given site, because stress can weaken a tree's ability to withstand the invasion of certain pests. Cultivars selected for their resistance to certain pests are often available. For example, many crabapple, Malus spp, cultivars are resistant to apple scab, a disfiguring disease of crabapples in temperate regions. There has been considerable debate about the use of native species versus introduced, non-native or exotic species. Native species, not surprisingly, usually grow well in their natural range. For several hundred years, botanists and horticulturists have been introducing species of trees and other plants from different parts of the world. Some introduced species have been very successful and some have become naturalized species, reproducing and thriving in their new settings for decades or even centuries. There are other instances, however, where introduced species are creating many problems. Some have been very invasive, virtually taking over landscapes. Other introduced trees have succumbed to pest problems, for which there are no natural predators or parasites in their home range. The most important thing is for arborists to select plants that will do well in a given site. In areas where new plantings are limited to native species by legislation, arborists sometimes have difficulty finding nurseries that grow appropriate species for urban plantings. Urban sites typically have altered soils and microclimates that do not mimic the native conditions of any species. In addition, urban plantings must hold up to the cultural and maintenance practices of the site, as well as factors involved with human interaction. Professionals should choose from a list of plants that grow in a site most like the planting site. For example, if the site has compacted soil, trees that grow well in low-oxygen environments should be considered. Selecting trees at the nursery. Once tree species have been chosen, the next step is selecting high-quality trees from the nursery. For a tree to be a success when transplanted into a landscape, it is important to begin with a healthy plant. Nursery-grown plants may be superior to trees collected from the woods or from unmanaged fields due to production and maintenance practices during early growth. Look for a vigorous plant with good shoot growth. Healthy, vigorous plants establish quickly in the landscape. Plants in poor health attract pests and require more maintenance. Examine the leaves and shoots. Choose trees with an abundance of healthy foliage. Check for the presence of insects or disease. Trees with good vertical and radial branch spacing are more likely to develop strong structure as they grow. Look for good trunk taper from the roots up to the branches. Most young trees should have a single central leader and good radial distribution of branches. Scaffold branches should be free of included bark and preferably less than half the diameter of the parent stem. Avoid trees with many upright branches unless an upright or columnar form is desired. Foliage should be evenly distributed on the upper two-thirds of the tree and not concentrated at the top. Check the plant for mechanical damage. Do not purchase a tree that has an injury to the trunk. Examine the root ball of the tree. In the field, the trunk flare, root flare, should be visible. If not, excavate soil to trunk flare depth prior to digging. If the tree is already bald and burlapped, It should have a solid ball that has been kept moist and protected from drying. If the plant is in a small container, remove the container to check the root system. Roots that are brown or black or have a foul odor indicate a health problem. The trunk flare should be visible at or just below the surface level. You may have to excavate some substrate to verify this condition. The trunk flare and large roots should be free of circling or kinked roots. Soil removal near the root collar may be necessary to inspect for circling or kinked roots. Selection of the particular tree from the nursery can be as important as selection of an appropriate tree species. Selecting a healthy plant with good form can help ensure that the tree will be an asset in the landscape.